In old American downtowns, there are small glass panels set right into the sidewalk. Most people step over them and keep moving. But those panels were not made for decoration. They were built to send daylight down into basement vaults below the street. National Park Service records say they became common in the 1850s. That is the part that caught me. Because once you know that, the ground stops feeling simple. It starts feeling layered, quietly, deeply, wrong. Then other details begin to surface. Windows half buried, doors sitting too low, entrance lines that do not match the sidewalk anymore. So what happened here? Did the building sink, or did the street rise? And if the street rose, how many old first floors are still down there, hidden in plain sight? That is the feeling I cannot shake. Not that something is missing. Something is still here, just lower, darker, and waiting under the version of the city we think we know. Once that glass under the sidewalk made sense, other details started pulling at me. Not one at a time, all at once. I stopped seeing old buildings as quiet. I started seeing them as interrupted. In Old Sacramento, historians do not just talk about age. They talk about change in level. They talk about disappearing windows. They talk about bricked-in windows that once belonged to the original first story. That phrase stayed with me, original first story, because that means some windows now sitting too low were not designed to look strange. They were designed for a different ground, a different street, a different version of normal. And then it gets worse. Some 19th century entryways in Sacramento were cut off when alleyways were raised to meet the new street grade. Not ruined by mystery, not swallowed by legend, just trapped by a higher city. You can still trace that change around the old grid near 8th and 9th Streets, especially along the I and J Street and K and L Street alleys, where old and new elevations do not fully hide from each other. So now the question starts changing shape. A buried window is not just a buried window. A low door is not just a low door. A sealed opening is not just damage. What if these are not random flaws at all? What if they are pressure marks, left behind when one layer of the city was forced to live underneath another? Because once one detail becomes two, and two become five, the feeling changes. It gets heavier, more specific, more difficult to laugh off. This is no longer about one strange feature. It is about a pattern of old access points, old sightlines, old first floors, all sitting lower than they should. And that leads to a question I could not avoid anymore. What if the buildings are not wrong? What if we are the ones standing on the wrong level? Then I found Chicago, and that is where this stopped feeling like a strange visual pattern and started feeling like a documented event. Because Chicago did not just grow in the 19th century, it lifted itself. By the late 1850s, large parts of the city were being razed to solve a drainage crisis. Streets across much of the south side, and parts of the north and west sides, were lifted by about 4 to 5 feet. That alone is enough to change how you see every old doorway in the city. But the real shock is what came next. In January of 1858, at Randolph and Dearborn, a 4-story brick building about 70 feet long and weighing around 750 tons was raised 6 feet with jack screws. Not demolished, not rebuilt, raised, intact. And that was only the beginning. In 1860, a row of buildings on Lake Street, roughly 320 feet long, was lifted in about 5 days using around 6,000 jack screws and about 600 workers. Businesses inside kept operating while the entire structure moved upward. That detail stayed with me. People were still walking in and out. Work was still happening. Goods were still being sold. And underneath all of that, the level of the city was changing. So now the buried windows in other places start looking different. The low doors start looking different. The misaligned thresholds, the awkward basement lines, the old openings that seemed too low to make sense. What if they made perfect sense when they were built? What if the buildings did not sink? What if the street came up to meet a new version of the city instead? And once that thought locks in, the question gets sharper. If Chicago could raise entire streets and buildings by several feet, how many old entrances across America are still sitting exactly where they always were, while the ground around them quietly changed the story? Then the pattern widened. Chicago showed me a city could raise itself, but Seattle and Galveston showed me something colder. A city does not just change its height, it changes its memory. The old level does not always disappear. Sometimes it stays right where it was, while life moves above it and starts calling it something else. A basement, a lower level, a leftover. But what if it was never any of those things when it was built? Seattle hit me first. On June 6, 1889, the Great Seattle Fire tore through the business district. What came after was not just rebuilding, it was regrading. In Pioneer Square, streets were raised 1 to 2 stories higher, generally about 12 feet, and in some places nearly 30 feet. At first, pedestrians had to climb ladders to move between the new street level and the old sidewalks in front of building entrances. Think about that image for a second. A doorway can stay where it always was and still become wrong, simply because the ground around it changed the story. Vault lights were then installed above the submerged sidewalks, sending daylight down into the gap between the raised street and the older building fronts. Suddenly, a basement might only be a former ground floor forced underground by a newer city. And then Galveston made the scale impossible to ignore. After the hurricane of 1900, the city did not just patch damage, it raised itself. The main grade-raising work ran from 1903 to 1911. About 500 city blocks were lifted with 16.3 million cubic yards of sand, spread from a few inches to as much as 11 feet thick. More than 2,000 structures were raised. St. Patrick Catholic Church on 35th Street was lifted 5 feet using about 700 jacks. One church, 700 jacks. A whole district slowly forced upward into a new version of itself. So now the low doors look different. The buried windows look different. The entrance lines that do not match the sidewalk anymore look different. Not broken, not random, displaced. And that changes the question again. Not, why does this building look wrong? But, what if it only looks wrong because we are standing on the level that came later? Old Sacramento was the moment this stopped feeling distant, because Chicago gave me numbers. Seattle gave me shock. But Sacramento gave me something worse. It gave me a place where the older level is not just documented. It is still there. California State Park still runs historic Old Sacramento underground tours. Not legend tours, not conspiracy tours. Underground tours, officially described as tours through Old Sacramento's underground spaces and hollow sidewalks, built around the city's early struggles with fire, disease, and flooding after 1848. That detail matters, because it means the hidden layer is not a rumor. It is part of the public historical story. Then I found the timeline, and the timeline made it heavier. In 1853, a huge proposal was made to raise Sacramento above flood level. It was too big, too expensive, too extreme, so it stalled. Then came the devastating flood of 1862, and after that, the city did what once sounded impossible. Within a few years, thousands of cubic yards of earth were hauled in, and the street raising began. That is not a dramatic interpretation. That is how the history is described. And the part I cannot shake is this. The original street level can still be seen throughout Old Sacramento under the boardwalks and in basements. Not guessed at. Seen? That means the older city did not vanish. It survived underneath the newer one. Quietly, literally, physically. Once that landed, every old entrance started to feel different. Because if an original street level is still sitting below the one we use now, then a low door may not be low at all. A buried window may not be a basement window in the way we assume. It may be the top edge of a room that once opened onto the active city. A doorway that feels wrong now may have been perfectly placed before the ground moved up around it. And Sacramento gives you more than one vague clue. The historical record for the area describes raised streets, hollow sidewalks, and visible elevation changes across the old district, especially within the raised streets and hollow sidewalks landscape created by modifications made between 1862 and 1878. This is not one strange building. It is an entire urban adjustment, still leaving scars you can walk past today. That is what changed the feeling for me. Before Sacramento, this was still a pattern I was tracking from city to city. After Sacramento, it became something more physical than that, more stubborn, more unsettling. Because once a city lets you stand on one level and look down into another, the question gets sharper. How many other places still carry an older version of themselves just below the surface? How many storefronts, thresholds, and first floors across America are being read from the wrong ground? And if the physical layer of a city can survive like that, beneath the newer story, what else can survive underneath a story long enough to be forgotten? At first, it was not even the name that got me. It was the repetition. You look at enough old maps, and then suddenly one word starts showing up again and again, not in one weird corner, not on one fringe document. Again and again. Tartary, Tartaria. Library of Congress says that for several hundred years, that name appeared on Western maps, usually spread somewhere between Eastern Europe and China. That matters. Not because it proves some lost empire. It does not. But because it proves the name was real, persistent, and normal enough to print over huge parts of the world. That is where this part of the investigation changed for me. Because up to this point, everything was physical. Glass in the sidewalk, buried windows, old street levels sitting below new ones. But maps are different. Maps do not just show land. They show what a civilization thinks it understands. And when the same broad name keeps appearing across centuries, that is not nothing. That is a pattern, a naming pattern, a memory pattern. The detail that really stayed with me was Abraham Ortelius. The Library of Congress points to the first edition of Ortelius's Theatrum Orbis Terrarum from 1570, which includes a dedicated map titled Tartaria Siue Magni Chami Imperiv. A dedicated map, not a tiny label hidden in the margins. A whole mapped region, and on that map, Tartaria stretches from the Volga River and the Caspian Sea in the west to the Pacific Ocean in the east, and from Persia and India in the south up toward the Arctic Ocean. That is not a small naming accident. That is a massive geographic frame. And then another detail made it even stranger. The same Library of Congress piece explains that Tartary was a broad historical place name used by Western mapmakers, and that the extra R in Tartary came from European writers blending Tatar with Tartarus, the underworld from Greek mythology. That means the name itself was already carrying distortion, already carrying confusion, already showing us that what later generations inherit is not always a clean description of reality, but a mixture of geography, fear, distance, and imperfect understanding. That is why this starts to feel relevant to everything else. Not because a map label proves anything about an old building in America, but because the pattern is similar. In the cities, older physical layers were not always destroyed. Sometimes they were lowered, covered, absorbed, and redefined. A former first floor becomes a basement. A former entrance becomes a lower entrance. A former street becomes the old street. And on the maps, something similar happens in language. A name that once stretched across enormous space becomes old-fashioned, then vague, then half-remembered, then suspicious simply because modern people are no longer used to seeing it. So this is the part I cannot ignore. Tartaria enters the story here not as proof, but as pressure, a real old name, on real old maps, repeated often enough to matter, broad enough to feel unsettling, and fading just enough to leave a gap between what earlier mapmakers thought they were naming and what later generations think was ever there at all. And once that gap opens, the question sharpens. If old cities can keep older levels buried under newer ones, what happens when history does the same thing with names? Maybe that is the part that stays with me most. Not the glass in the sidewalk, not the buried windows, not even the old maps with a name that does not sit comfortably in the modern world anymore. It is the feeling they leave when you put them side by side, because none of these clues, on their own, are enough to close the case. Vault lights were real pieces of city infrastructure. Chicago really did raise streets and buildings. Seattle really did push older levels below newer ones. Old Sacramento still lets people see parts of that older layer. And Tartary really did appear on Western maps for centuries. All of that is documented. All of it is real. And still, the question does not go away. Maybe Tartaria is not the answer. Maybe it is only the name that starts appearing when too many old things stop fitting neatly inside the story attached to them. A low door, a sealed window, a buried first floor. An old map label stretched across a region most people today could not define the same way twice. Maybe none of that proves a lost civilization. But maybe proof is not the only thing that matters. Maybe sometimes what matters first is pressure. Repetition. The moment a pattern becomes too consistent to laugh off, but still too incomplete to explain cleanly. That is where I am with this. Not at a conclusion, at a threshold. And maybe that is the real reason this subject refuses to die. Because it does not end with a neat answer. It ends with a discomfort, a sense that the newest surface, the newest name, the newest version of the story may not be the whole story after all. So the next time you see glass under a sidewalk, a doorway sitting too low, or a building that feels slightly out of place, do not rush past it. Look twice, and ask yourself one hard question. Are you looking at something forgotten, or something that was never fully explained?